And thank you so much for tuning in on this Workers' Day holiday. And of course, it's just a week to go until South Africans decide at the polls. And it's crunch time, of course, the election's here. And today, in a week's time, as I was saying, we will be casting those votes. The questions asked, however, are about whether we as a nation are heading for more coalition politics. And will there be a new party that takes over? Will the ruling party retain its majority? So many questions, so many permutations. And of course, how will labor unions have their say in determining what the outcome is at the polls? So let's try and get some analysis on how Professor Richard Calland from the University of Cape Town School of Public Law sees this playing out. Thanks so much for coming through.
Great pleasure, Sakina. Wonderful to be on your show again.
So, of course, after 2016, which was pretty much a watershed in terms of election outcomes, we've seen up until that point pretty much the ANC in the driving seat. But then came the local government elections in 2016 and turned that on its head. And we saw quite a few coalitions having to be formed. But before we even get into the politics here in South Africa, let's just talk about coalitions more broadly speaking. So in terms of the types of coalitions that exist, and also what is the rationale for having coalitions?
Well, coalitions come in all shapes and sizes, and it's a very flexible but also therefore potentially quite unstable form of politics. And it requires very skillful political management and political craft. And it requires the establishment of kind of conventions of practice and behaviour to ensure that those coalitions, when they form, are sustainable. And we've seen examples in Nelson Mandela Bay of where that hasn't happened, where the coalition arrangements have proved to be very unstable because there wasn't perhaps the conventions or the practice or the experience or the skill to put them into effect. One of the examples that we have from Britain at the moment is the confidence and supply agreement, as it's called, between the Ulster Unionists, 10 MPs in the House of Commons, and Theresa May's Conservative Party. That's not a coalition as such, it's a cooperation. And it's quite similar, in fact, the more I think about it, to the arrangements that the EFF has here in Gauteng with the DA in Tshwane and the DA in Johannesburg. It's not actually a coalition arrangement, it's a kind of agreement, a cooperation that keeps the DA in power even though they have a minority government. So the core rationale, to come back to your question finally, usually is about acquiring executive power. A coalition arrangement is necessary when the electorate has not given one single party a full majority. In other words, they don't get the 51%. And they need the support of other parties in some way or other to get them over the line so that they can form a government. That's the core rationale.
And of course, we are thinking of it because we seem to be pretty much still experimenting and getting our heads wrapped around how these coalitions actually work. But they can, of course, be struck even before the elections. Interestingly, yesterday we had BLF's President Andile Ngxitama here yesterday, and he was saying to me about them post the election trying to gain entry into the alliance with the ANC. So, you know, it raises questions about when these coalition agreements are actually struck, because we generally tend to think, oh, we're going to check, what the election outcome is before we actually see these sort of maneuverings.
You're quite right, but the fundamental point you're making there, which is this, that when a big party fails to win or fails to get the majority it needs to govern on its own, then smaller parties suddenly get into the game. They suddenly become very influential and very powerful, and they start to lick their lips at the prospects of that option. So one can well imagine that someone like the BLF would be delighted if the ANC was to fall just beneath 50%, because then they could become a kingmaker. And then a party with, say, one seat in the Gauteng legislature, which has 73 seats, and the majority therefore is 37. Let's say the ANC, and this is a reasonable and plausible prediction, say the ANC drops to 48%, and it's two seats short. If the BLF was to win 2 seats, then that could be the difference. That could make them the kingmaker. And they would obviously strike a deal, probably around policy issues such as land, which is their main driving policy issue. And then the ANC would probably have to make concessions on that issue in order to strike a coalition agreement with them.
But looking at some of the forecasts and predictions that obviously the parties would make themselves at this stage, do you think that anyone is actually wheeling and dealing at this stage already, trying to form coalitions,
Yes.
before the election?
So one of the reasons I'm up in Johannesburg at the moment and Pretoria is to talk to people about this issue. And I can assure you that there is plenty of conversation going on privately. No one at this point wants to talk about it publicly, the reason being that it's seen as a sign of weakness. So to use the word of a member of the national executive of one party in this country, it is a taboo subject at the moment. We can't speak about it publicly because the electorate will think, well, we're weak, we're anticipating defeat or failure, and therefore we're already planning for that. Now that, to me, is a sign of, if I may say so, the immaturity of coalition politics in this country. Because coalition politics should not be seen necessarily as a sign of weakness. Coalition politics is about two things: getting power in the first place, the rationale, the fundamental rationale as we discussed earlier. But secondly, it's an opportunity to build bridges. It's an opportunity to do deals, reach agreements with a broader range of political actors, which can actually serve to create a kind of peace building, if you like, nation building dimension to our politics, which is often absent. We've seen in this election how the temperatures have risen, how the anger has grown between different communities. Coalitions can help to overcome that. In the early 2000s in Kenya, the two major opposition parties, reflecting major divisions in society that often ended in violence and death, came together into a big coalition agreement called the NARC agreement, which was a major structure. It failed in the end, years later, but for a few years it held the middle ground and it created peace where otherwise there might have been civil war.
But then, of course, there is the question of the motivation for entering into these coalitions. Is it personal? Is it about power for certain parties? Or is it actually about policy and advancing that?
So that's a great question, because it's often thought, and this arose, of course, with the EFF and the DA, how can parties that are ideologically or on a values basis very, very different, how and in what possible circumstances can they enter into a coalition agreement? Well, it's clear from the international story and the comparative research we've done as part of this initiative, which is called the Building and Sustaining of Coalition Politics Initiative. The research shows that actually ideology isn't the only factor, and often it's not the main factor. It's not necessarily a particularly important factor. What matters is, can the coalition partners find sufficient common cause? Can they structure their agreement in a way that is resilient and which is durable? And can they put in place the arrangements necessary to manage that coalition from a political management and strategic point of view? And if they can do those things, they may be very different ideologically and have very different worldviews, but still find a way of running a stable coalition.
But if you look at our experience in South Africa, and you pointed to the example of Nelson Mandela Bay earlier, and you also said, some of these are indicators of how immature we are as a nation when it comes to coalition politics. That instability, looking at how parties actually approach these coalitions or these arrangements, as in the case of the EFF and the DA, are we likely to see more of that if we indeed have more coalitions after this election?
Well, in the end, the electorate are going to answer that question, because the electorate next week and in future elections is going to decide whether it wants to give one party a big majority or not. And I suspect that coalition politics are here to stay. We've got them throughout the country in big cities and small towns, and we may find it in a big province in Gauteng next Thursday or Friday when the results come in. So I do think coalition politics are here to stay. We're going to have to learn as a political society how to do it better, how to develop the maturity, the conventions, the practice. My kind of chief diagnostic about Nelson Mandela Bay, and there are many other reasons, so I don't want to be unfair on the DA, but the fact is the DA did not handle that arrangement well, because they behaved like the dominant dog in the pack. They said, we're the party with 45% or whatever it was, and you little guys are just making up the numbers to get us over the line. And what they didn't do was respect the power of those small parties.
If you look at the ANC, Ekurhuleni, for example, that coalition agreement with a party like the AIC, who started out in Matatiele about that boundary dispute, and they are still waiting for the ANC to deliver on the promise that was made to get them into that coalition?
Well, that's an interesting question. If that is the case, and I'm sure you're right, Sakina, you usually are, then the AIC is not playing the game very smartly, because they've got a lot of power in that relationship. They are the tail that wags the dog. And they should be clear, and they should have been clear, and this is a very important point. They should have been very clear when they entered into that deal with the ANC that the one red line issue for them was that Tetatele boundary dispute. They should have got an agreement on that before giving the ANC power. So one of the important features of good coalition politics we've learned from the experience elsewhere is you have to be very clear in your negotiating phase what are the red line issues on policy and principle that must be underlying the structure and the arrangement that then follows.
Okay, so we've seen the instability where there has been a coalition governments. I think Johannesburg has done slightly better than most, but that's because I think Herman Mashaba, as he was saying earlier to Leanne, understands, and he says the EFF would go with them on an issue-by-issue basis. So I think they have a much clearer understanding of the arrangement in which they've entered into in Johannesburg. But for voters sitting out there trying to make up their minds about where to cast their vote next week, what are some of the advantages and the disadvantages of coalitions? Because if someone is thinking, okay, I'm so disgruntled with the bigger parties, let me give my vote to a smaller party. If these smaller parties do in fact do as well as the predictions indicate, what are the advantages and disadvantages of coalitions?
Well, I think one advantage, as I've said, for smaller parties is that coalition politics can make them relevant, can make them even quite powerful. And so if you're a voter supporting a smaller party and you end up in a coalition arrangement with a hung legislature, then your vote may well matter more than otherwise, because your representative, the person you voted for, the person who's got a seat in the legislature as a result of your vote, and others, of course, then is a kingmaker. And can exercise that king-making role in a way that gives effect to your voice as a voter. So that's an exciting possibility, perhaps. Of course, one of the issues that you're alluding to, I think, is whether or not political leaders should be transparent ahead of election day about who they're going to do deals with. And I understand your colleague Leanne spoke to Mayor Mashaba earlier. I crossed swords with him in 2016 when I was pretending to do what you do on a daily basis as a stand-in radio show host on another station. And I interviewed him and I pressed him very hard on who he would do a deal with if the DA was the biggest party but without a majority in Johannesburg. He refused to answer. He got quite upset with me and stormed off in the end. I thought that was a great success of an interview. I'm not sure if it was or not. But the interesting point was he just would not commit himself either way. I can understand why he wanted to play his cards close to his chest, but from a voter perspective, it's a big deal. Will the DA do a deal with the ANC, or will it do a deal with the EFF? And if, for example, you're a voter who really doesn't like the EFF, and then you discover 3 days after the election that the party you voted for has done a deal with the EFF, that could cause you a great deal of consternation. So I think more transparency is necessary in order to allow voters a greater sense of what they're actually voting for.
And just finally, perhaps, looking at all of those issues that you've highlighted, what makes an effective coalition?
Well, I think the leadership is a leadership issue in many ways. The leaders have got to be very clear with each other about what the essence and the rationale of the arrangement is. They've got to be clear in negotiating the red line issues so they don't fall into the trap that the Liberals fell into in 2010 in Britain when they brought the Conservative Party into government as a coalition partner and then allowed the Conservatives to ride roughshod over their number one issue, which was free education at universities. And then the Liberal Party collapsed after that. Members were so upset. So communicating, a third point, communicating with your members, explaining why it is you've done that deal and entered into that coalition arrangement is crucial. I learnt last year from the Green Party of Germany, Secretary General. The Green Party of Germany is in 12 different coalition arrangements across Germany in various cities and provinces, and 11 of them are with different partners, which sounds rather promiscuous. And if you're going to have that complexity of arrangements, you've got to be very clear in communicating why and on what basis you are doing that with your members and with the broader electorate.
Well, Richard Calland, fascinating insights there. Thanks so much for sharing them with us. And Professor Richard Calland is from the University of Cape Town School of Public Law and giving us his analysis on possible coalition politics. And of course, we go to the polls next week, and it's going to be interesting to see whether we're going to have more coalitions and how they play out.